Good morning. I'm Gord Long. It's my pleasure to have with me this morning Charles Hugh Smith, well-known and prolific writer on the web, who is the publisher of the website of2minds.com and a longtime co-host with me over at Macro Analytics. Welcome, Charles.
Thank you, Gordon. My pleasure to be here as always.
Yes, nice to talk again. I want to talk this month, Charles, is about your new book. Yet another one. Which number is this one now?
I think it's number 9 in the nonfiction. Yeah.
I know that because we've been reviewing every year. We seem to do another one together, but and they're all great. I need to say they're all great books. Charles, let's just jump right into it. What made you write this book? What was the motivation on this particular subject?
Okay, that's an excellent question for any author. What I wanted to do was encapsulate in a very short form. This book is only 27,000 words, about 90 pages. What I've heard you discuss with all your guests and what you and I have discussed for years, which is the status quo is broken. It isn't going to work. It isn't going to be able to solve the problems. And we need to accept that reality so that we can move on. So that's the reason why I got the book.
Okay. In the first chapter, I found pretty intriguing, and that was this humanity's 6 integrating problems, and that you really break into. And I'd like if you could step us through those, just briefly describing. I mean, some of them are pretty self-explanatory, I think, but each of them.
Yeah, I'd be delighted to. The core of my idea of this book is that humanity has 6 problems which are interconnected. And if the status quo, which whether you want to call it the establishment or whatever term you want to use, if our current arrangement of economic and political power can't solve these problems, then we need a new system. It just boils down to that. And so the 6 problems are entrenched poverty. Now we know that China's development has raised at least 300 million people out of poverty, and hundreds of millions of other previously really poor people are doing better in the last 20-year boom. But there still remains tremendous entrenched poverty. Hundreds of millions of other people who have not gotten a better life, and their access to the tools to work their way out of poverty, they just don't have that access. And so the idea that we're going to reach every human being on the planet with the existing tools, I think, is been proven incorrect. The second one is our whole model is we're going to use more of everything in a world of finite resources. And the idea is there's infinite energy, there's infinite copper, there's infinite lithium, and yet right now there's a global oversupply, right? Because everyone ramped up to deal with China's consumption, but China's consumption has now fading because they've already built hundreds of millions of units of housing and so on. But if we look farther ahead than just this year or next year, we've got to run into the reality that there isn't endless amounts of lithium that we can mine for auto batteries, for example, or that all of our resources become more and more expensive to get out of the ground and process. And so and if we're going to bring another 3 billion people on the planet into the middle class, the consumption of these resources is just going to skyrocket to levels that would quickly soak up the oversupply we have right now. So we have to look beyond this growth model to what a lot of people call degrowth, making better use of the resources we have instead of just relying on consuming more. The third point is, right now, we only have one way of distributing the output of the economy, which is wages. In other words, the idea is that enterprises will hire people and pay them wages, and as the economy grows, more people will be paid more wages. And we can look at a chart. I can send you a chart that shows labor's share of GDP has been declining since 1970. In other words, the reality is the GDP, the share of wages has actually been declining for over 40 years. In other words, the share of our national output that's going to wages and salaries is declining. And we've spoken about this in previous shows, and you've spoken about it with other guests, which is with automation and technology, there's less need for human labor, and that will be continuing as a trend into the indefinite future.
And
So
what's ironic is that even with that and automation, traditionally increased productivity. The last 10 years, productivity has been falling off.
That's right.
So a lot of the technologies we're using are not producing the productivity that we would have thought. Example: walk around and see millennials with all their heads down doing Facebook back and forth. Tremendous technology, but where's the return on investment other than some advertising dollars in a fixed advertising economy? It's not creating new markets at the same rate that increases productivity for a country. That is real wealth. That's the issue, and I think that's being lost. Don't get me wrong, robotics but it increases productivity, but it's at the cost of labor being slashed right up. But anyway, I don't mean to divert.
Yeah. So and then the fourth point that's a problem is when you consolidate power in a central state, then you create an opportunity for concentrations of wealth to control or buy influence over that central state. And this is the model we have. We call it crony capitalism. I call it cartel state capitalism. And we see it everywhere, where the industries are controlled by a handful of players who have great political influence. This is higher education, the pharmaceutical industry, defense industries, and so on. And so this model's broken, and we all know it. And that's why a lot of people are turning to Trump and Sanders, is they realize that the big money players control the political process, and they rig it to benefit themselves. And if you and I, had $10 billion, we'd rig it to benefit ourselves too. It's just human instinct. So it's the system that's broken, not the people in the system.
Yeah, Charles, we talked extensively a few years back about a roadmap that we were seeing unfolding, that where more and more centralization, we thought things like financial repression growing, all of this stuff's unfolded, but we saw it leading to statism, real control, authoritarian, centralized decision making, and clearly that roadmap has unfolded and is what we're getting now. And I know that just this week we had the leaks of what's in the TTIP, that is the transnational, transatlantic, and trade and investment partnership with Europe, and it's just absolutely terrifying of what's in there, of the controls corporations can have of suing governments, being held not liable in courts, but in a court run by the corporations. I'm not trying to be anti-corporate here, but it's government for the corporations by the corporations. If you read that document that came out through WikiLeaks, so I was anticipating it, but I was even frightened when I read it. So it did take us off track, but these are legitimate, serious issues.
That's an excellent example, Gordon. And the fifth point is by depending on credit for everything, not just the private sector, but the corporate sector and the government sector, we're borrowing from the future or to fund today's consumption. And we think that that's a permanent solution. And obviously it isn't, because you're borrowing from the future to pay for today's consumption. That's a broken model. The last point is a lot of people might not agree with this, or they may not have thought about it, but I see the current system as having a crisis of purpose and meaning. And let me give you an example. The status quo solution to robotics and the advance of automation is a guaranteed income for every household. In other words, what I would call super welfare. We're just going to pay people to sit around and do nothing at home or fool around on social media. But the people who propose this don't understand that people need work, they need livelihoods, they need a positive social role in their community. And just paying them to sit home and do nothing actually creates a whole other set of problems. People become depressed, and it's just not human. Humans need purpose and meaning, and they need a work and a livelihood and a positive social role. So the system that we have now, that's not a solution. Paying people to sit home and do nothing. And so these are the 6 problems, and they're all connected. And that's what the book is about. And I would say that my analogy is, we all know that cap is a word that describes a lot of different systems. The free market, the use of capital flowing to the highest returns, and so on. A lot of people recognize that the current iteration of capitalism is inadequate. We need a new version of capitalism. And a lot of us see the outlines of that new system already in place, which is decentralized. In other words, instead of centralizing power, we decentralize and empower communities so that we have a community economy rather than central planned economy. And so, anyways, that's what the book addresses, is kind of like, if you're on the Titanic, who do you think has the best chances of surviving? The people who are absolutely confident the ship's unsinkable, even as the bow dips lower and lower into the cold Atlantic, or the people who realize, wow, this thing is really sinking. I better make some other plans. And that's what the book is about, is let's admit the ship is sinking and we're going to have to make other arrangements.
Exactly. Charles, you in this new era, or new normal, that you brought some charts that really show how this is showing itself today. But before we started here this morning, we were talking about, is that manifesting itself now in why the millennial generation itself seems to be migrating to platforms that, in a dominant way, that people like Bernie Sanders, at least in the United States, are proposing, a more socialist, a much more left-wing, because they've just lost confidence in the system. They've lost confidence in what they perceive to be capitalism, because of what they've observed, that it's just not working. The system, status quo, is not working for them. And this is getting to be a bigger part of, we're talking about anybody on the age of 32. This is getting to be a more dominant part of our economic system.
That's right, Gordon. And since we're borrowing from the future, we're actually to fund today's consumption, then it's a form of intergenerational theft. We're loading all this debt, trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars of debt, onto the millennials and the generation behind them, just to fund today's consumption. And that's like morally wrong, but it's also economically bankrupt. And they're realizing this, because they're the ones who are supposed to somehow pay all this.
I mentioned these some charts that you brought with you, Charles, came from another article that you wrote, but this new normal. Could you take us through them?
Yeah, and I want to connect what a lot of people call the new normal, which is all the central planning arrangements and policies that have been in place since the global financial meltdown of 2008, 2009. And so we all know these chapter and verse, right? Zero interest rates or negative interest rates, monetizing the central state's debt. In other words, the governments sell bonds, the central banks buy the bonds with newly created money to fund current consumption, but it's still debt, right? Corporations are buying back shares rather than investing in new products and services. All the whole raft of policies, we call it the new normal. And so, like, say, one new normal is this first chart is federal government ownership of student debt, student loans. And it climbed from zero, and now it's on this incredible ascent where the government is buying all of the student loans. It's
the only way that to mask the bankruptcy of the student loan system. And
the government has to buy them because nobody else is going to pay for them or fund them, other than initially fund them and pass it to Sally Mae, etc., is because they're unpayable.
That's right.
You don't lend money to somebody who you believe is not going to be able to pay them back in full on a timely basis. And that's why out of the $1.2 trillion in student loans we have now, I think close to 600 billion of them now are in a new category called forbearance. Used to be non-performing, delinquent. We had these categories of levels leading to default. Now we kind of just poo-poo it and put them in forbearance. Forbearance means they're not going to be paid, but we're not writing them off. I think that's because they expect the government to come in and pay for it. But that says the system's broken.
That's right. That's not solving the underlying problem, which is higher education's costs have soared. Why have they soared? Because student loans have made it easy for the higher education cartel to just keep raising their prices because there's always more money. And so and yet the education itself is often really poor. In other words, the students get a degree, but they don't really have the tools and skill sets needed for the current economy. So the second slide is about the diminishing returns on soaring debt. And, we've covered this again and again where, it takes more and more debt to edge GDP a little bit higher. And you can see that GDP in the US and in other developed economies like the EU and Japan has been really subpar. I mean, it's been barely above 1%. It kind of touches 2% every once in a while. But meanwhile, all of this really subpar GDP expansion has been driven by extraordinary expansions of debt.
Yeah, I'm at the point now, Charles. I got charts that show more debt is actually working against us. It's actually now hurting because there's just not enough real wealth being generated to pay for it. It's just stripping out our ability to invest, and there's a lack of savings. And therefore you cripple yourself, and throwing more debt at it doesn't work.
Right. And then the other part of the new normal, Gordon, that you've talked about many times is there's a chart of China's lending spree here that instead of dealing with non-performing loans like bad debt, in other words, loans that were made to entities or people who have no way to pay them. And so then the new normal is issue a new loan. So the basically insolvent, creditor can then use this new money to pay interest on the old loan, right? Or to roll bad debt into an even larger loan of bad debt. And so that's China's policy right now, and that's the new normal everywhere around the world. And it's obviously not going to work, right? I mean, creating more debt to hide your non-performing loans.
The debt is inextinguishable. That's the problem. And the central banks can do a fantastic job of creating liquidity. They can't solve the solvency problem. And this is suggesting the central issue with debt is solvency now. That is inability to ever extinguish it. And by throwing more money at the system just creates more malinvestment, to be too simplistic. And especially, as you stated earlier, with overcapacity out there that cheap money has brought, which makes it harder to get pricing power. And so it forces in, what I'm trying to say is it forces in deflationary pressures. And more money forces more and more deflationary pressures into it. At some point it breaks, and then could have hyperinflation. As I've said many times, there's a loss in the currency, confidence in the currency. That's a different problem.
Right. And speaking of currency, the next slide is of the assets owned by the Bank of Japan. And this is also a new normal policy around the world, which is for central banks to buy stocks and bonds directly as a way of propping up the market. And we can see that the Bank of Japan went from around 1 trillion yen of assets owned to 4 trillion in just a few years.
Yeah, they're the biggest holder of ETFs in Japan, is the Japanese government or the Bank of Japan. I mean, so that's and there's been reported that there's about $29 trillion now of assets that are now owned by sovereign wealth funds, corporations, government entities, government-controlled pensions, etc., that are being pushed into the asset markets, which in itself makes them artificial. And once you get onto that, like Japan, and start doing that, you can't get off that roller coaster. You start to pull back, they collapse, and they all get leveraged up as collateral. And I'm terrified that may be the new normal.
Yes, and I think that if we look at the next chart, which is the Federal Reserve's balance sheet, we see exactly what you just described, which is the Fed creates money out of thin air and buys more assets. In this case, U.S. Treasuries and mortgages are their primary assets. And then it levels off, and then markets weaken, the economy weakens, and then they ramp up their balance sheet again. And as you'll see here, it's like a stair step. Their balance sheet never declines. It only plateaus for a brief period, and then it goes up again in the next crisis. And so the strategy of the new normal is the central banks and states are propping up markets, because if the markets collapse to what we might call their organic value, their true value, that would reveal the bankruptcy of the entire system. And so they can't let that happen. But as you say, that creates an artificiality that weakens and makes the markets more fragile anyway. The next chart here is the current civilian employment to population ratio, the percentage of the population that has a job. And you'll see that it looks like a classic head and shoulders, that during the great bubble boom eras of the 90s and 2000s, a lot more people, a greater percentage of the population had jobs. Now it's fallen back to levels of the 1970s. And so fewer people are working, and they're earning less money if we adjust for inflation. In other words, their purchasing power of their wages has declined. And so it's stagnation, right? I mean, if fewer people are working and they're making less money, is it any wonder the economy is stagnating? And then the next chart shows that most of the gains, and the gains are modest, but the gains that have been registered are flowing to the top 5%. And the bottom 95%'s income and wealth is stagnating. And I want to point out, this is not just because, a few greedy people at the top have taken the gains. There is that element, right, as we've discussed. The market's rigged in favor of the most powerful players. But there's also this technology that we've talked about many times, which is global competition and technology. It places a premium on those workers who have the skill sets to generate value with this higher technology and to manage the people beneath them. So it's something that you can't attribute to a government policy or to some bad rich people. It's much more secular, and it's much more global. That the wage increases that go to the 5% reflect these technological and managerial realities, that just working in a factory or in a white-collar job, you're not creating a premium in an economy that's pressured by global competition and automation. You have to be on top of that and creating value at the very highest level. And so it's no wonder that the top 5% are scooping all the gains. And then my last chart here is the civilian population ratio and the velocity of money, of into money.
I thought this is a really powerful chart, and it's the first time I had seen it is when you actually put it out. I think one of your readers had actually sent it to you, right, Charles?
That's right. Well, why don't you speak to this? I mean, it's just incredible.
Yeah, well, I did. I was stunned at the tremendous correlation. We all know that the participation rate, the population and the shift, and we've actually talked about this extensively, but money velocity has been falling, and everybody's concerned why the money velocity is falling, but it says there's no growth. People are actually, it's changing behavior. I think they're trying to save more. We're not seeing savings, but because it's being absorbed in growing costs and therefore inflationary pressures of debt expenses, if you would. So that's why the money velocity is falling off. But the jobs themselves aren't paying. We all know that aren't paying the same kind of level. So they're dropping out of the labor force, trying to start businesses, whatever, and therefore you got this shift. But what was telling on this chart is the divergence we saw there in 2008, 2009, and that's when we went into hyper printing of money to try and basically put the system on life support. Something absolutely fractured globally during the financial crisis. And it says, and I believe it's because the productivity numbers in the developed world are falling off. There's lack of growth. Growth is not real growth. It's artificial growth right now. How did you interpret the chart?
I agree with you, Gordon. I think that the many people sense that the system is broken, and that the rational response is to tighten their belts and set aside what they can. Now, we know that many Americans have very, very little savings, but people are tightening their belts and doing what they can.
It's not that they're trying to be extravagant. They have no savings. They just can't get by right now. They just can't make a go of it, and things are getting more expensive and more debt. So if their behavior is just one of survival, which is effectively savings, but it's not showing up in any account that says they've saved money.
Right.
Look
right.
at like proof of that is look at the gasoline prices. It dropped so dramatically in America. You know, we were paying close over $4 a gallon, and it dropped down to below $2. That usually is a tremendous economic positive impulse stimulus to an economy. And 10 years ago, 20 years ago, that would have been dramatic. We didn't even notice it. So where did all that savings, which is quite significant, go? It just went into absorbing the cost increases that are coming out of services, food, etc. There is real inflation at the real level, education, etc. Healthcare coverages, daycare coverages. These are where the monies are going, but our CPI doesn't report it correctly.
Exactly. And so I think, Gordon, if I had to sort of summarize what the book is about and what our topic is here is, we all know the system broke in 2008. And we need structural reform of entitlements. We need a new form of capitalism that's decentralized, that's more accessible to people, that's not just controlled from the top down, like central planning. And but we're not getting that. Instead, we're getting like a hyper monetary policy. In other words, we're looking the status quo is looking to the central banks to solve all the problems by issuing more credit and more liquidity. And the problem we're really dealing with is these problems cannot be solved with just more debt and more credit. If that were the solution, everything would be going great. But that's not a solution. These are much deeper problems that you can't just paper over with more credit. And yet that's the only solution the status quo has. So we're going to have to deal with the reality that we need much deeper structural reforms. And this is economic, political, social.
For those who've watched caterpillars out in construction sites going around plowing dirt, you'll notice that the guy has quite a number of levers that he pulls to steer it, to move it. And what's happening, it's the same way with running economies. You've got a lot of different levers you need to pull. And the one we keep pulling, we're trying to steer this thing, is one lever, and it's called the monetary policy. And if you just pull on one lever, the thing's liable to go around in circles and don't go anywhere. And the other levers are fiscal policy, which we're not using, public policy, taxation policy, and policies in the public domain and taxation that are structural oriented. These are the elements that come out of the political process, the political apparatus. So I would lay the problems at a lot of these levers at the feet of the Congress, the Senate, and in terms of the United States, but at a devoid of leadership of coming up with solutions. I'm no big fan of the central banks, but it's unfair to ask the central bankers just to pull harder on that lever and get us out of here. We just go around in smaller and smaller circles until things break, and that's what's happening. And I just don't see the leadership standing up. And I think in the primaries, I don't mean to get long-winded here, Charles, but in the primaries right now, I think that's what we're seeing. People are saying it's not working, and that's why they're migrating to Trump, why they're migrating to Sanders right now, because they're saying, I may not like your policies, but right now it's better than nothing, because nothing's coming out of Washington. Am I too harsh in that?
No, not at all, Gordon. And as you have a chart that we often refer to, as you said, increasing statism, as the concentrations of power grapple with these issues, the one thing they can't do is let go of some of their power, which is exactly what is required going forward for real solutions.
They will not give up the status quo. You'll have to pull it from their dying hands. And you're not the same way. Well, you're not going to give it up. I mean, you've worked hard for it, you've achieved it. But the reason I'm saying the system's broken. And then there has to be a more equitable sharing. A reward system for those who go out and do it, absolutely. And they deserve their wealth. But there needs to be a better balance. In my opinion, we're living in the new Gilded Age. A Gilded Age that the robber barons in the late 1800s, early 1900s, we had to stop. We had to get into monopoly, anti-monopoly, breaking them up. When was the last time we broke up a corporation because it was too big? We say, hell, they're too big to fail now. They're too big to jail. They're too big to regulate. They're too big to police. And don't get me wrong, I don't think the people running the corporations are all bad people. They're just doing their job. It's a systemic, it's a structural kind of problem.
That's right. And we could also just maybe mention that the other structural problem is our system has now become riddled with perverse incentives. You know, it's the big gains go from kind of gaming the system and cheating on your grades. If you're a student, you know, everybody buys a paper on the internet to get an A, right? And you know, if a professor gives someone a B, then he gets a negative rating, and he can be fired or demoted if enough students complain that he didn't give everybody an A. I mean, what kind of system do you get with those kind of perverse incentives? Not to mention all the financially perverse incentives we've discussed. So the system is riddled with perverse incentives, and so when we talk about structural reform, one of the things we're talking about is replacing all these perverse, destructive incentives with positive incentives, you know, that actually benefit the system as well as the participant. And we've completely lost that.
When you allow things to go on, such as unsound money for a protracted period of time, and you get moral hazard, unintended consequences, all sorts of mispricing of risk. We've talked about many of these things. For a period of time, what happens is moral fiber starts to break down. Value systems start to change because the motivations are changed. Therefore, words like integrity and character and things that steer an economy in a subtle way very much get lost. And I just witnessed, I went to see The Big Short here a little while ago. And it just very clearly demonstrates the level of corruption that is being built into the system. Not just what they were seeing in the show, but what they were one of the characters was saying he was so frustrated because of the degree that he saw all around him and every facet. And I think that's one of the things I took away from that movie is it is in every facet, not just Wall Street. And it's to be expected when you have new normals that are built on false myths. And what's good about this is eventually it resets. Because one of the things you can have a lot of faith in is mankind. And it'll reset, we will survive, we'll come out of it. But unfortunately it leads to crisis, and it's always the innocent people that are most hurt in this. So great job on the book, Charles, bringing this out. A lot of the subjects we talked about here this morning also have been in previous books of yours. So a lot of these subjects have been dedicated subjects for some of the people that aren't familiar with your works. Charles, we have to wrap. Any final messages you'd like to leave with our listeners on the book? And there it is.
If I was going to promote the book, I would simply say I've compressed everything into 90 pages. And that's the advantage of this book, is it's really short. And
I don't think you can beat the price on this one.
Yeah, $3.95 Kindle. So and you can read this first section on my website of twominds.com.
At that price, I don't think it's going to put you into that top half of 1% category. But we never know, right?
Well, we're reformers, Gordon. We have a moral cause here, which is to bring the world to real solutions instead of fake solutions that just make the problems worse.
Yeah, who else but us would do this for nothing? But
that's right.
It's our old gray hairs have a message. Charles, always enjoy talking to you. Talk to you again.
Thank you, Gordon.